Baked potatoes at 3 a.m. There was something strange going on. Phil was hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. Then when the sun would rise he would find the kitchen littered with candles placed in a circle in the middle of the kitchen, right in between the kitchen counter and the oven would be left on. It made Phil think of a summoning circle, like the one he would make when trying to let his lady death have control of his body. Only there were no markings except for the candles melted onto the floor. He hadn't long moved in with Techno, the two now sharing the same living space. Phil wasn't sure if Techno was even aware that something like this was happening, or how long this had been happening. He was almost positive that it only started happening when he moved in. As far as Phil knew, he rose earlier than Techno, so it was entirely possible that Techno didn't know what was going on in his home. Phil usually had the candles cleaned up like nothing had happened before his best friend rose with the sun. He didn't want to worry his friend, after they just established a peaceful life in the Arctic. "Morning, Phil." Techno greeted, snapping the avian from his thoughts. "Morning, mate. Sleep well?" Phil greeted back, taking a sip of coffee. "Yup," Techno said, going straight to the pantry, while stifling a yawn. "We're out of potatoes again," he announced, grabbing an apple instead. Phil hummed, watching as his friend munched on the apple. That was something else that kept happening. Their stash of potatoes was disappearing faster than the both of them could eat. Not that Techno seemed to eat breakfast really. The piglin hybrid seemed to just grab a simple apple, banana, or orange and wouldn't come back hungry until lunchtime. But still, Phil knew that his friend liked potatoes. It was his go-to meal. Someone was stealing from them and making weird summoning circles out of candles on their kitchen floor. "I'm going to go harvest some more," Techno announced before he left out of the door. Phil hummed again, waiting for the door to shut before setting his coffee cup down and rubbed worryingly at his head. He was going to have to figure out what was going on. Who was sneaking into their kitchen and steal Techno's potatoes? And why when Phil moved in? He wanted to figure out what was the cause before Techno started to notice. He didn't want his friend on high alert anymore. Not after they just began to live a somewhat peaceful life. He sometimes wondered if he should suggest Techno to take the hounds for a run or hunting. Not only to maybe help Techno get rid of some steam, but the hounds themselves, the creatures seemed to be gaining a bit of weight now that they weren't used for war. So when nighttime came, Phil didn't go to bed, he stayed up. Listening. Waiting. The moon moved slowly in the sky as the house stayed silent. The snow falling gracefully outside his window and on the already snow-covered ground that glistened and shimmered in the moonlight, the nighttime silent and peaceful, allowing for sleep to sweep through the creatures around. Well, except for Phil. Phil sat ridged on the edge of his bed. There was a faint sound of a floorboard creaking that alerted him of movement. And grumbling. That was how it always started. Then there would be banging. Nothing too loud, but loud enough for Phil to hear and for it to disturb what would be a peaceful night's sleep. But not tonight. Tonight he was ready. He was awake. He waited a few minutes for the sound to travel further from him where he knew it would be in the kitchen. Then he slowly got up and tiptoed to his door and silently opened it. He looked at Techno's door, finding it closed like always. That was normal. He turned his head to look to the stairs that led downstairs. He could still hear noises coming from there, rustling and light banging. Phil quickly ducked back in his room and grabbed his bedside candle and lit it. He hoped the soft light of the candle would blend with the ones that he knew would be lit in the kitchen. With practiced silent feet, Phil moved silently through the house. His black wings tucked in close to his back, so they wouldn't bump into anything. He wanted to catch the culprit red-handed. Depending on what or who it was, would determine his next action. He paused at the doorway of the kitchen, keeping out of sight, and silently listened. He could see the soft light of the candles in the kitchen and a soft rustling of clothes, that moved every now and then. A person then. He flicked his talons in preparation. Someone was in their house, melting candles to their floor and eating Techno's potatoes. He was not going to let them leave without some sort of punishment for their wrongs. Taking a ready breath, he stepped into the kitchen doorway, Blackwing snapping open and blocking any escape attempt. He would have hissed too, but didn't when he saw who it was. Techno was sitting on the kitchen floor in the middle of the circle of candles, hugging his knees, as he stared blankly at the oven, that was cooking several potatoes within it. He even had oven mitts on his hands. "Techno," he said in a surprised tone, though it came out in a whisper for some reason. Techno made a grunting noise, not taking his eyes off the potatoes behind the oven glass. What are you doing up, mate? It's like 3 a.m. he asked, setting his candle on the kitchen counter, and slowly approached his friend. Techno still didn't look at him. "Mate." Phil tried again. Techno slowly swayed as his continued to stare at the oven door, with a half-lidded gaze. Phil leaned over and in front of his friend a little bit. "Techno? You good, mate?" he asked. Techno's mouth moved, but Phil didn't catch the words. "What was that?" he asked, leaning closer to his friend. "Potatoes," Techno mumbled. Phil waved his hand in front of his friend's face, a little concerned, that soon melted away, as he watched Techno's half-lidded gaze drift close, followed by a soft snore. "Potatoes," Techno mumbled again. Phil sighed, relieved. Techno was sleep cooking. And possibly eating? Phil looked at the oven to the baked potatoes inside cooking. "Mate, I think the leftover stress is leaking out in your sleep," he said to his sleeping friend. He guessed after a lifetime of fighting, all that pent-up stress would show itself in one form or another. Phil guessed this was a better way than going out and getting caught up in another war. He quietly flapped his wings, the gust of wind from them, extinguishing the circle of candles. "I think the potatoes are done, mate," he said, softly, and backed up when Techno's eyes slowly peeked open, dazedly looking at the oven with unseeing eyes. "Potatoes," he groaned, arms unwrapping from around his legs, and moved almost robotically to his feet, bending and opening the oven, and reaching in with his mitts-covered hands to pull the tray of potatoes out. Curious, Phil just watched as his friend took the tray from the kitchen and followed when Techno opened the front door and walked out barefoot. Phil followed Techno to the barn where the sleepwalking piglin hybrid stepped in. Phil stepped in after him, watching as the hounds left over from the war, and Techno's pet polar bear, all roused from their slumber and as if familiar with the routine, swarmed happily around Techno, as the sleeping man casually dumped the tray of potatoes onto the floor of the barn, where the hounds all lunged for the cooked potatoes. Well, Phil guessed that explained why the creatures looked like they were gaining weight. They were being fed extra, by their sleep-cooking and sleep-walking owner. Phil couldn't help the chuckle that escaped him as he continued to follow Techno through his sleep-walking routine, all the way to when his friend finally went back to bed. Brian swooping into the house when they had re-entered the house. "Well, I guess that explains that," he said to his oldest crow. Phil didn't go right back to his room, once he was sure Techno was down for the night. He went to the kitchen to clean up what his sleeping friend had left behind. The melted candles on the floor and the oven that was left on. Then he went to bed. The next morning he slept a little over, but still managed to get up before Techno. He had just finished making his coffee, when Techno emerged from the stairs, still shaking off the last remnants of sleep. "Morning, philosophy," he greeted. "Morning, mate." Phil smiled, watching as his friend went to the pantry. "Don't worry about the potatoes. I got up early and made hash browns," he said, seeing Techno searching for the potatoes he had harvested yesterday, but had unknowingly cooked and fed to his hound in the middle of the night, while sleepwalking. Phil had went on ahead to get the potatoes ready from their garden and fixed Techno the breakfast he knew the piglin hybrid wanted. "Oh, thanks." Techno smiled. "Bruh, I think I need a new bed." I feel like I get no sleep at all. He chatted, as he began to dig into his breakfast. Phil smiled behind his coffee mug. You don't say. The end.